The cabin crew member smirked as she yanked the fragile elderly man down the narrow aisle, brushing off his hushed objections. To her, he was just another insignificant traveler. But within a few short hours, when the aircraft touched down, she'd come to understand the astonishing truth. The man she'd just mistreated was far more powerful than anyone on board, and there would be no avoiding the fallout. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if stories like this strike a chord with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional tales. That evening, the terminal at Stanton International Airport buzzed with energy, packed with people trying to make their flights. Among the crowd was a stooped man named Elliot Granger. His thin frame was wrapped in an aged, threadbare coat. Each step he took was slow, deliberate, and slightly unstable. In one hand, he clutched a weathered leather case, his other arm gently swaying at his side. His silvery hair was neatly brushed back, and the deep etches across his face spoke of a life long and full. As he approached the boarding area, few airline staff even noticed him. He simply blended in with the sea of weary passengers. Reaching the document check counter, he offered a courteous smile to the uniformed staff member scanning tickets. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Melissa Shaw, barely glanced at him. Her tone was flat, her eyes already drifting away. "Passport and boarding pass," she snapped, not even bothering to look him in the eye. Elliot handed over the documents, his hands trembling slightly with age. She scanned them quickly, already sounding annoyed. "You're in economy," she muttered, handing them back before turning her attention elsewhere. He nodded and moved toward the jet bridge, his slow steps echoing down the metal ramp. The boarding line was long, passengers eager to find their seats. Just ahead, a woman named Camille struggled to hoist her carry-on into the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, Elliot stepped forward to steady the bag and gently push it into place. Camille offered him a warm, grateful smile before sliding into her seat. Farther up the aisle, a flight attendant named Erica Monroe was arranging the pillows in first class. Her uniform was spotless, her posture strict, and her eyes sharp as they swept over each passenger entering the plane. The moment she noticed Elliot boarding, her brow creased ever so slightly. Something about his slow, fragile movements triggered her impatience. She turned away, brushing off the thought. Elliot moved down the aisle cautiously, his eyes scanning for his seat number. Just then, a young couple, Brad and Tessa, hurried past him, nearly knocking him off balance in their rush. He stumbled, but managed to catch himself by grabbing onto a nearby seat's armrest. Erica, who had been watching from up ahead, approached with brisk, impatient steps. "Sir, please keep moving," she said sharply, her voice clipped. Elliot gave a quiet nod of apology and kept going, though his slow pace clearly irritated her. When he reached his assigned row, he attempted to lift his briefcase into the overhead bin. His hands shook slightly from the effort. With a dramatic sigh, Erica stepped in, snatching the case from his grip. "This should have been checked in," she muttered under her breath, cramming the bag into the compartment and slamming it shut. Elliot didn't object. He simply nodded, then eased into his seat with visible effort. His breathing had grown heavier from the small task. He folded his hands in his lap and turned toward the window, his expression unreadable. Around him, passengers settled in, clicking seatbelts and flipping through the in-flight entertainment. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi down the runway. From her post, Erica glanced back at Elliot one last time, her lips tightening into a thin line. Something about him rubbed her the wrong way, though she couldn't quite explain why. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, Elliot closed his eyes for a moment. His fingers brushed the surface of his briefcase. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen a faint, knowing smile tug at the corner of his lips, just for a second, before disappearing like it was never there. The engines hummed steadily as the plane climbed through the clouds. Passengers around him settled into their routines, adjusting headrests and tapping through their screens. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. Elliot remained still, his gaze distant, eyes fixed on the endless stretch of sky. Elliot's fingers rested softly on the edge of his old leather briefcase, the surface worn and smooth from decades of use. Down the aisle, Erica Monroe moved briskly, inspecting seatbelts and locking meal carts in place. Her eyes darted sharply from row to row, alert and calculating. When she reached Elliot's seat, she paused. The annoyance she'd felt earlier still lingered. She looked down at him, taking in his fragile posture, the slow, deliberate way he turned his head to acknowledge her. "Do you need anything, sir?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. The question felt more like an obligation than a genuine offer. Elliot met her gaze calmly, his pale blue eyes untroubled. "No, thank you," he replied softly but clearly. Erica gave a curt nod and moved on, mentally checking him off her list. To her, he was just another older passenger, likely someone who would require help later in the flight. And she valued efficiency above all else. People who slowed her down. She had no patience for them. A few rows ahead, Leo Barrett, a younger flight attendant with a warm demeanor, was gently tucking a blanket around an elderly woman. His voice was kind and his hands steady. As he glanced back toward Elliot's row, he noticed how Erica had interacted with the man. Something about her tone didn't sit right with him, but he stayed quiet, for now. Soon, the clatter of meal carts rolled through the cabin. Trays were passed from row to row, and the smell of warm food filled the air. Elliot sat quietly, watching the cart draw closer. His stomach gave a faint, uncomfortable reminder. It had been hours since he'd last eaten. When Erica reached his row, she hesitated, checking her list. "You didn't pre-select a meal, sir," she said flatly. Elliot's brow creased ever so slightly. "I'm fairly certain I did," he replied, his tone polite, yet firm. Erica sighed, already irritated. "There's no record here. We only have enough for those who reserved in advance." Across the aisle, a businessman named Mark Delaney looked up from his tray. He had caught the edge in Erica's voice earlier, and now watched the scene with mild curiosity. Elliot simply nodded and leaned back in his seat, saying nothing more. Moments later, Leo appeared, having noticed the exchange. "We've got an extra tray in the galley," he offered, already reaching for it. But before he could hand it over, Erica stopped him with a subtle shake of her head. "He didn't pre-order. There are procedures, Leo." Leo hesitated, looking between her and Elliot. "It's just one extra. He should have something to eat." Erica's expression tightened. "That's not how this works," she said, pushing the cart forward without another glance. Elliot remained still, his face unreadable. Mark, the businessman, gave a small shake of his head and muttered under his breath. The moment passed, but tension lingered in the air. Passengers returned to their trays, though more than a few had taken notice. Leo glanced back at Elliot, regret in his eyes. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'll see what I can find for you, sir." Elliot gave a quiet nod but didn't respond. His gaze returned to the clouds beyond the window, fingers tapping gently on his briefcase. Meanwhile, Erica carried on, convinced she'd done her job by the book. She didn't notice the silent looks exchanged between those who had witnessed the moment. She didn't see how Elliot's calm wasn't resignation. It was something else. The food trays were cleared. The scent of dinner faded, replaced once again by the soft hum of engines. Elliot sat motionless, his hands resting on the armrests, his eyes fixed on the sky. He hadn't spoken another word since the brief conversation with Erica. If he felt offended, he didn't show it. But others had noticed. Mark leaned slightly across the aisle. "That wasn't right," he said under his breath. "You paid for this flight like anyone else." Elliot turned to him slowly, offering a quiet nod. "People reveal who they truly are," he said, "when they believe no one important is watching." Moments later, Leo returned from the galley, holding a small wrapped sandwich. He crouched beside Elliot, speaking quietly. "I managed to grab this for you, sir. It's not much, but—" Before Elliot could accept it, Erica reappeared beside them. Her sharp eyes locked onto the sandwich in Leo's hand, and she quickly reached out, taking it from him. "Leo," she said in a hushed but firm tone, "we don't bend the rules. If we make one exception, others will expect the same." Leo clenched his jaw, biting back a response. Erica turned her attention to Elliot. Her tone was cool, clipped. "Sir, if you require special arrangements in the future, I suggest handling them before boarding." Elliot held her gaze, unshaken. Then with a nod so subtle it could have been missed, he replied, "I'll remember that." The way he said it made something in Erica shift, though she couldn't explain why. She returned the sandwich to the cart and pushed it away without another word. Across the aisle, Mark exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Passengers nearby whispered quietly to one another. Their meal might have continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Elliot said nothing, but everyone was beginning to understand. He wasn't just being quiet. He was waiting. Before Leo could offer the sandwich to Elliot, Erica Monroe stepped in sharply and snatched it from his hands. "Leo," she said in a low but firm voice, "we don't make exceptions. If we start doing it for one person, we'll be expected to do it for everyone." Leo's jaw tightened. He didn't argue, but his eyes said everything. Erica then turned to Elliot, her tone now more clipped than before. "Sir, I understand that you might require special accommodations, but we have protocols for a reason. Next time, please make sure to arrange your meal selection in advance." Elliot didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable as he met her gaze. Then, with a calm, deliberate nod, he replied, "I'll keep that in mind." Something about the way he said it made Erica pause. A flicker of unease passed through her, but she shook it off, returning the sandwich to the cart and pushing it away. Across the aisle, Mark Delaney let out a quiet breath. "Unreal," he muttered. Other passengers had noticed too. Their hushed murmurs filled the cabin. A woman seated behind Elliot leaned toward her husband. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "They wouldn't even let him have a simple sandwich." Her husband shook his head. What harm is there in feeding an old man? The atmosphere had shifted. The incident had been small, but its impact rippled through the cabin. People who'd been absorbed in books, movies, or phones were now watching closely. Elliot, however, remained composed. His fingers once again brushed the worn surface of his briefcase. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaken. He was waiting. In the galley, Erica stacked the last of the meal trays away. Leo Barrett stood beside her, arms crossed, his discontent clear on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Erica barely acknowledged him. "I was following company policy," Leo scoffed softly. "No, you were being cruel." Erica turned to face him, lowering her voice, but not her attitude. "I don't write the rules, Leo. If he wanted a meal, he should have planned ahead." Leo's mouth tightened. "Or maybe you just didn't like how he looked." Erica's shoulders stiffened. Her grip tightened on the edge of the service cart. She didn't reply, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Leo watching her disappear down the aisle. The flight carried on, smooth and uneventful on the surface. But something was different now. A subtle shift. Passengers were no longer passively riding out the journey. They were paying attention, watching, evaluating. And Elliot Granger, the frail old man who had been brushed aside, simply waited in silence. The cabin settled into a quiet lull. Most passengers had dozed off, flipped through screens, or turned pages in paperbacks. Overhead, lights cast a soft glow, and the steady hum of the aircraft filled the silence. Elliot remained seated, calm and still, but his mind was sharp, focused. His fingers slowly traced the edges of the briefcase resting on his lap. That small movement was the only sign that his thoughts were still turning. He was in no rush. Years of experience had taught him the value of observation, the value of waiting. A few rows ahead, Erica walked the aisle with her usual precision. She enjoyed this part of the job, when the cabin was quiet and she could exert total control. Her authority felt secure. At least, that's what she thought. As she entered first class, her demeanor shifted instantly. She offered a bright smile to a group of well-dressed travelers. Her posture softened, her voice gentler. One of the passengers, a man in a tailored Navy suit named Gregory Lane, returned her greeting with a polite nod before resuming a conversation with his colleague. Back in economy, Elliot reached for his water bottle. The cap was sealed tightly. Though his hands were steady, they lacked the strength they once had. He twisted it slowly, but it wouldn't budge. Across the aisle, Mark noticed. "Here, let me help you," he offered, reaching over. Elliot gave a small nod of thanks and handed him the bottle. Just as Mark was about to open it, Erica's voice snapped through the cabin like a whip. "Sir, please remain in your seat. Unnecessary movement is discouraged." Mark looked up, surprised by her sudden sharpness. "I was just helping him open his water bottle," he replied, confused. Erica's eyes flicked between the two of them. "If he needs help, he should request it from a crew member," she said coldly. Mark's jaw clenched as he twisted the cap open and handed the bottle back to Elliot. "Well, now he doesn't need your help, does he?" he said under his breath. Elliot took the bottle and gave a small, respectful nod, then turned his eyes back toward the window. Erica didn't reply. She simply stood there for a moment longer, then turned and moved down the aisle. But more people had noticed this time, and their silence wasn't indifference. It was judgment. Elliot accepted the bottle of water from Mark, his grip steady. He looked at Erica Monroe for a brief moment, calm, unbothered, then turned away and took a slow sip. Erica pressed her lips into a thin, tight line. "Just remember, sir," she said coldly, "there are rules on this flight for a reason." Mark leaned back in his seat, shaking his head with a quiet scoff. "And some people act like they make the rules, not just follow them." Erica ignored him and continued down the aisle, but the exchange hadn't gone unnoticed. Around them, whispers were starting to pick up. Low voices shared quiet outrage, their words heavy with discontent. Minutes later, Erica returned to the galley, tugging at her uniform as she pulled out the passenger manifest. Her eyes scanned the list of names, stopping for a beat on Elliot Granger. Something about the name gave her pause, though she quickly dismissed it. Just another elderly man in coach. One of countless she'd served over the years. Nearby, Leo Barrett stood with arms crossed, having watched the entire scene unfold between her and Mark. His patience, stretched thin, finally snapped. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked, shaking his head. Erica exhaled in frustration. "If you've got something to say, Leo, then say it." He stepped closer, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "You treat people differently based on how they look, or where they sit. First class gets all your charm. Coach gets whatever scraps of patience you've got left." Erica smirked, but her annoyance showed through. "That's called efficiency. If you're too soft, people take advantage." Leo's voice dropped, but his conviction only grew. "Or maybe you're just afraid to treat everyone with equal respect." She rolled her eyes and brushed past him. "Get back to work." Leo watched her walk away, shaking his head. He had a sinking feeling, one he couldn't ignore. She was going to regret this flight, but it wasn't his battle to fight. Back in his seat, Elliot remained composed, his expression unreadable. His patience was long, but not limitless. He had dealt with people like Erica before, people who couldn't see past appearances, who mistook quiet for weakness. She would learn soon enough. For now, he waited. The aircraft hummed steadily as it cruised through the sky. Passengers settled in. Some reclined, dozing off. Others tapped through entertainment menus or scrolled their phones. But an underlying tension hung in the air, an invisible thread that tied a handful of passengers together. They had seen how Erica treated Elliot, and though no one wanted to stir conflict, the silence in the cabin was no longer neutral. It was watchful. Elliot sat quietly, his gaze on the clouds outside. His expression remained calm, almost serene, but inside, his mind was sharp, focused. He had sat through boardroom meetings just like this, people underestimating him, dismissing him, thinking they held the power. He had learned exactly when to observe and when to act. Suddenly, the plane jolted, a quick tremor. The captain's voice broke through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain in your seats and fasten your seat belts." Erica immediately made her way down the aisle, checking on passengers, urging them to comply. As she passed Elliot's row, she barely acknowledged him, too absorbed in keeping order. A few seats ahead, an elderly woman named Mildred struggled to fasten her seatbelt. Her hands, thin and trembling, fumbled with the buckle. She turned to the man beside her, hoping for help. Before he could move, Erica stepped in with a brisk voice. "Ma'am, if you need assistance, please press your call button." She was gone before Mildred could respond. The man next to her frowned and leaned over anyway. quietly buckling the strap across her lap. Mildred offered a soft thank you and turned her attention away from the aisle. Another jolt rocked the aircraft. At the same moment, Elliot reached for his briefcase and lost his balance slightly. He caught himself on the armrest in front of him, steadying his posture. Erica noticed and turned sharply. "Sir, I need you to stay seated and stop grabbing at other passengers," she said curtly. Elliot looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. His voice was even. "I was just steadying myself." Erica crossed her arms. "If you can't manage your balance, you should have requested assistance before boarding," she said, loudly enough for others to hear. Several heads turned. Mark narrowed his eyes. Mildred frowned. Even Leo, watching from the galley, looked ready to intervene. Elliot didn't flinch. He said nothing more. But in that moment, the balance of the flight had shifted. The calm old man wasn't the one unraveling. Across the aisle, Mildred let out a quiet scoff. Her brows drew together in disapproval. Even Leo Barrett, still standing near the galley, looked ready to step in. But Elliot Granger said nothing. He simply held Erica Monroe's gaze, steady, unblinking. There was something in his expression that unsettled her. She couldn't quite place it, but it lingered. Then a voice broke through the moment. "Is there a problem here?" It was Mark Delaney, his tone calm but firm. He wasn't looking at Erica. He was looking at Elliot, offering silent support. Erica straightened her posture immediately. "No issue," she replied curtly. "Just making sure everything is in order." Mark's expression darkened slightly. Funny how order seems to matter more with some passengers than others. Erica didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked briskly down the aisle, as if trying to outrun the discomfort settling over her. Leo stepped closer to Elliot, his voice low. "You okay, sir?" Elliot gave a single nod. "I'm fine. Thank you." Leo hesitated a moment, sensing the weight in the air. "If you need anything at all, just let me know." Elliot offered a faint smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate that." Leo turned and walked back toward the galley, but something tugged at him. A quiet instinct told him this situation was far from finished. Up at the front of the plane, Erica returned to the first-class cabin, her entire demeanor shifting. Gone was the cold efficiency. In its place was warmth, poise, even charm. She smiled at passengers, adjusted pillows with care, and ensured every glass was full. But back in coach, those who had watched her earlier were still thinking about what they'd seen. The difference in how she treated passengers wasn't subtle anymore. It was undeniable. Elliot reached for his briefcase again, this time unlatching it just slightly. Inside, his fingers brushed across a neatly stacked bundle of documents. His expression remained calm, thoughtful. He wasn't ready to act yet, but the time was coming. The turbulence subsided, and the cabin slowly returned to a state of uneasy quiet. Screens lit up again. Headphones slipped back on, but beneath the surface, the tension lingered. Whispers passed between seats. Erica glided effortlessly through first class, all pleasant smiles and perfect posture. But in the rows behind her, eyes followed every move she made. People had noticed, and they weren't forgetting. Elliot sat still, one hand resting gently on his briefcase. His expression was unreadable, but he wasn't lost in thought. He was waiting, watching. He had never demanded attention or respect, but he had never allowed disrespect to go unchecked either. From the corner of his eye, he watched Erica, still oblivious to the storm she had started. A chime rang out over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for mid-flight beverage service." Leo emerged from the galley with a rolling cart, moving carefully through the aisle. When he reached Elliot's row, he paused and smiled. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Elliot looked up thoughtfully. "Just some tea, if you have it." "Coming right up." Leo poured the cup and handed it over with quiet care. "Let me know if you need anything else." Before Elliot could respond, Erica appeared suddenly behind Leo. Her presence was sharp, like a sudden gust of cold air. "Keep moving," she ordered, her voice low but pointed. Leo frowned slightly, but pushed the cart forward without a word. Erica turned back toward Elliot. Her expression was neutral, but her voice carried an edge of something colder. "I hope you're comfortable now, sir." There was something artificial in her tone, an almost mocking politeness hiding behind her professionalism. She still didn't know. She had no idea who she was speaking to. No idea how close she stood to the edge of consequences. Elliot studied her for a moment, his gaze calm and steady. Then he spoke, his voice even. "It's been an interesting flight." Erica's jaw tightened. "I'm sure," she said flatly, before walking away again. Just a few rows behind, Mark watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. He'd spent years in boardrooms. He knew how to read people. And Elliot, quiet, unassuming, composed, was no ordinary passenger. Mildred leaned toward her husband. "She doesn't realize who she's messing with," she whispered. Her husband gave a knowing nod. "She's about to find out." Erica Monroe continued her duties as if nothing had happened, completely unaware of the shift unfolding around her. The whispers had grown louder. The once subtle glances had become disapproving stares. But she dismissed them, just as she always had. She'd flown hundreds of routes, dealt with every type of passenger. To her, Elliot Granger was just another frail, forgettable face in economy class, someone who would gripe and move on like the rest. But Elliot wasn't moving on. He reached into his briefcase, opened it with care, and pulled out a sleek phone. With steady fingers, he typed a brief message, only a few words, but powerful enough to set everything in motion. A moment later, the device buzzed in his hand. "Understood. We'll be ready upon landing." He placed the phone back into the case and closed it softly. The flight continued, calm on the surface. But for Erica, the real turbulence hadn't even begun. The engine's low hum filled the cabin as hours passed. Some passengers slept. Others watched the glowing screens in front of them or sat in quiet thought. But the tension, first sparked hours ago, had only thickened. Conversations grew more intentional. Side eyes more frequent. Word had spread. More and more people were now aware of what had happened between Erica and the old man with the quiet eyes. Mark Delaney, still keeping an eye on Elliot, sat with his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He'd worked in high-level corporate roles for decades, long enough to recognize when someone powerful was playing the long game. And Elliot wasn't who he first seemed. The way he remained composed, the way he responded with patience instead of outrage. Mark had seen it before. It was the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to demand respect because they already had it. Elliot sat still, his hands folded calmly atop his briefcase. His face revealed nothing, but his thoughts were focused, strategic. The message had been sent. Now, he waited. Meanwhile, Erica moved effortlessly through first class, all charm and warmth. She made sure every glass was topped off, blankets fluffed, seats perfectly adjusted. Her professionalism was flawless here. The difference between her service up front and in the rear of the plane was now painfully obvious. Too many had noticed. As she passed Mark's row, on her way back to the galley, he looked up. "You're very committed to making first class comfortable," he said casually. "What about the rest of the cabin?" Erica flashed a tight, controlled smile. "Every passenger receives the service they're entitled to, sir." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" He gestured subtly toward Elliot. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like some passengers are treated a bit differently." Her smile flickered for just a moment before she smoothed it out. "I assure you, I follow standard procedure with everyone." Mark chuckled under his breath. "Standard procedure, huh? Let's see how that holds up in a few hours." Erica's eyes narrowed slightly, unsure what he meant. But before she could respond, a soft chime drew her attention. A call light blinked in first class. She turned and walked away. Back in economy, Leo approached Elliot once more. This time, he crouched beside the seat so their conversation wouldn't draw attention. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," Leo said quietly, "but something tells me you're not just another passenger." Elliot turned his head slowly, eyes full of quiet amusement. "And what makes you think that?" Leo glanced toward the front of the plane, then back at him. "Because I've seen people like you before. You don't react the way most people would. You're too calm, too patient." He paused, "And I saw you send that message earlier." Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his teacup and took a slow sip. Then, resting it back down, he spoke softly. "I appreciate your kindness, Leo. It's rare to find someone in your position who still believes in fairness." Leo lowered his voice further. "She's been treating you horribly, and we both know it. I have a feeling she's going to regret that." Elliot smiled faintly, fingers brushing the rim of his cup. "We all face the consequences of our choices, sooner or later." Leo looked at him, a sense of awe growing behind his eyes. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew Erica wouldn't see it coming. As he stood and returned to his duties, Elliot checked his phone again. Landing was only a few hours away. That would be plenty of time. It was time to let things unfold, naturally. Elliot Granger sat quietly, knowing everything was already in motion. Meanwhile, Erica Monroe, still blind to the quiet storm forming around her, moved through the cabin without a care. She had convinced herself that any grumbling from passengers would vanish the moment they reached their destination. People always complained on flights, but they rarely did anything about it afterward. That had always been her experience. She didn't know Elliot had already ensured this flight would be different. The plane pushed forward through the night sky. Stars scattered across the darkness beyond the windows. But for Erica, the real descent hadn't even begun. The soft glow of the overhead lights cast long, stretching shadows across the rows of resting passengers. The engine's hum was steady, a reminder of how far they'd come since takeoff. Many travelers were now dozing, lost in thought, or gazing at their screens. But the air felt different. There was an invisible current running through the cabin now, charged with tension and quiet anticipation. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Elliot remained in his seat, posture relaxed, eyes steady. His fingers traced the edges of his briefcase. Inside, it was everything Erica had dismissed, everything she believed didn't matter. He had seen people like her before, arrogant, rule-driven, obsessed with control, believing that power came from policies, from telling others where they belonged. But true power, that wasn't loud. It didn't bark orders or cling to authority. It waited. It watched. And when the moment came, it moved with precision. Erica strode down the aisle, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She believed everything was under control. The turbulence had passed. First class was content, and whatever tension had existed in economy earlier, well, she figured it would vanish once the wheels touched down. To her, complaints were just background noise. But the whispers hadn't faded. They had grown, quieter, but sharper, more intentional. Passengers weren't forgetting. They were watching. They were waiting. At the front of the plane, Gregory Lane, a businessman in first class, checked his phone. A notification lit up on his screen, an internal alert from the airline's executive team. His eyes shifted subtly toward the back of the plane, settling on Elliot for just a moment. He exhaled slowly and slipped the phone back into his jacket. Erica made her way to the galley, focused on prepping for final service. Leo Barrett stood inside, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She barely looked at him. "Are the landing forms ready?" she asked, rifling through papers. Leo didn't move. "Erica?" he said, his voice steady, almost calm. She looked up, slightly annoyed. "What?" He paused, debating whether to speak his mind. Then he let out a slow breath. "You should be more careful about how you treat people." She rolled her eyes. "Seriously? Not this again." She closed the folder in front of her and turned to him. "Leo, I know you love playing the moral hero, but this is a job. I follow the rules. If people don't like it, that's not on me." Leo studied her, his gaze unwavering. "You really don't see it, do you?" She sighed in frustration. "See what?" "The way everyone's looking at you now," he said plainly. "They're not just annoyed. They're waiting." Erica scoffed. "You're being dramatic. People always complain. Then they land. Then they forget. I've done this job long enough to know how it works." Leo didn't argue. He just looked at her, the way someone watches another person walk straight toward a cliff, knowing they won't stop until it's too late. Erica grabbed the landing forms and turned to leave. "Just do your job, Leo." He didn't stop her. He knew she wasn't ready to hear the truth. Back in his seat, Elliot slid his hand into his pocket and checked his phone. A new message had arrived. "Confirmed. All arrangements in place." He closed the message and slid the phone away, a faint smile touching his lips. The others around him had no idea what was coming, but soon they would. And as for Erica Monroe, she was about to experience a descent unlike any she'd ever prepared for. The final stretch of the flight had begun, but for her, the real turbulence was just ahead. Passengers were now awake, shifting in their seats, stretching tired legs, and preparing for descent. The overhead signs lit up, reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. But this time, the routine felt different. There was something lingering in the air, something unspoken, a quiet electricity connecting row after row. Those who had witnessed Erica Monroe's treatment of Elliot Granger were no longer just quiet observers. They had seen. They had whispered. They had judged. And now, they were waiting. Elliot remained perfectly still, his hands resting atop his briefcase, his gaze calm and unshaken. He hadn't said much, but he didn't need to. His silence had said everything. It was deliberate, measured, powerful. He wasn't in a rush. And that, more than anything, set him apart. A few rows away, Mark Delaney checked his watch. His patience was thinning. He was a man who had spent his career reading boardrooms, recognizing power plays, and predicting regret long before it arrived. He'd noticed Elliot from the very beginning, not because of his frailty, but because of his stillness, his patience. It wasn't weakness. It was control. Erica moved briskly through the aisle, performing her final checks. She told herself this was just another descent, that the unease in her chest was just fatigue. But as she glanced around, she felt them. Eyes that had once ignored her were now tracking her every move. She reached Elliot's row. "Seatbelt, sir," she said. Her voice clipped. Elliot turned and met her gaze. The belt was already fastened. She hesitated, just for a second, then moved on. The aircraft dipped slightly, beginning its approach. Outside, city lights sparkled like scattered diamonds across the darkness. The end of the flight was near. But for Erica, something was unraveling. In the galley, Leo stood near the intercom, fingers tapping lightly on the counter. He had a feeling, deep and uneasy, that the moment they touched down, everything was going to change. And Erica, she had no idea. Then, it happened. A ding sounded overhead, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Erica exhaled, quietly relieved. Almost there. She was moments away from putting this strange, frustrating flight behind her. Back to normal. Back to routine. Then the unexpected happened. The cockpit door unlocked with a soft click and opened. Gasps rippled quietly across the cabin as the captain himself stepped out. A tall, composed man with a commanding presence and eyes that missed nothing. He rarely left the flight deck unless absolutely necessary. All heads turned. A few passengers murmured under their breath. Even Erica froze, blinking in confusion. The captain cleared his throat. His voice was calm, but carried unmistakable weight. "Mr. Granger?" Elliot slowly lifted his head, his expression unchanged, steady, quietly commanding. "We've been notified of your presence on this flight, sir," the captain continued. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced." A silence fell over the cabin, dense, heavy, absolute. Passengers froze mid-movement. Eyes darted between the old man and the captain. Confusion gave way to realization. Erica's heart skipped. She turned slowly toward Elliot. Her breath caught. No, that couldn't be right. He was just an old man, a quiet, slow-moving, nobody in economy. Except, he wasn't. The realization hit her like a gust of frigid air. Elliot Granger, not just a passenger, not just another aging man struggling to lift a bag. He was the principal shareholder of the airline, the man who owned more of the company than anyone else, the man she had ignored, dismissed, and belittled in front of an entire plane full of witnesses. Her chest tightened. Her palms grew clammy. A wave of whispers surged through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers turned to one another, voices low but urgent, eyes wide with disbelief. Mark leaned back in his seat, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Knew it," he murmured. A few rows back, Mildred clutched her husband's arm, stunned. She had no idea who Elliot was when she first saw him. But now she understood everything. And as for Erica, her carefully constructed image was beginning to collapse, row by row, whisper by whisper. Leo Barrett inhaled sharply. His eyes locked on Erica Monroe, waiting to see how she would react. But Erica was frozen. The captain's voice continued, unaware of the way her skin had gone pale, how tightly she now gripped the edge of the service cart, as though it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "We've already contacted our executive team, sir," the captain said with quiet respect. "They'll be waiting upon landing to discuss any concerns you may have." Elliot Granger gave a slow, composed nod. "I appreciate that," he replied, his voice as calm as ever. And just like that, the entire dynamic of the cabin shifted. The passengers were no longer just watching. They were witnessing the exact moment when Erica's carefully constructed world began to fall apart. Her throat felt like sandpaper. The weight of 100 eyes settled on her, not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with judgment. She had spent the entire flight treating Elliot like he was beneath her. An inconvenience, a delay, a burden. Now, she had to face the truth. She had humiliated the most powerful man on the aircraft, and there would be consequences. The plane continued its descent, but to Erica, it felt like the ground was rushing up at her too fast, too soon. The whispers swirled like static, low, relentless, impossible to ignore. Each one was another thread unraveling her grip on the moment. Elliot Granger. The name echoed in her head, again and again, each repetition slicing deeper. He wasn't just some elderly man with a shaky hand and a worn-out coat. He wasn't just another passenger she could overlook. He owned the airline. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She stood near the galley, her fingers numb, her mind whirling. It felt like a dream. Except it was real, and everyone around her knew it. Passengers exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others smirking as if they'd just watched a live downfall. They weren't just witnessing embarrassment. They were witnessing accountability. From across the aisle, Mark Delaney chuckled quietly, stretching out his legs. "That flight attendant's about to have the worst day of her career," he murmured. Mildred, seated beside her husband, gave a small nod. "She had plenty of chances to do the right thing," she said softly. "Now she's going to learn what happens when you forget that kindness costs nothing." Leo, standing just behind Erica, noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes darted toward first class, searching for a way out. He sighed, shaking his head. "Told you," he muttered. But there was no satisfaction in his voice, only resignation. Erica's legs felt like lead as she finally turned toward Elliot's row. Her heart thundered against her chest. The captain was still standing nearby, waiting respectfully as Elliot calmly closed his briefcase and adjusted his coat. Every movement Elliot made was slow, deliberate. He hadn't changed at all. But now, everyone else saw what he had been all along. Erica took a shaky step forward, attempting a polite smile. But her lips refused to cooperate. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Mr. Granger, Elliot lifted a hand. Just a small, quiet gesture, but it silenced her instantly. "I have nothing to discuss with you," he said smoothly, never even looking at her. His attention remained on the captain. "I'll handle the matter with the executive team." Erica's stomach twisted. No, that wasn't good. If this had just been about the meal, the seat, or the bag. She could have apologized. She could have fixed it, but he wasn't even speaking to her. That meant this was bigger. Much bigger. Her skin prickled with panic. She didn't know how to breathe. Then came the intercom. "Cabin crew, please take your seats for landing." The captain gave Elliot a small nod, then returned to the cockpit. Erica stood in the aisle, paralyzed, but she had no choice now. She turned toward the galley, her movements robotic, her thoughts spiraling. Every step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Leo watched as she sank stiffly into the jump seat across from him. Her face was drained of color. Her eyes stared forward, but she wasn't seeing anything. Erica Monroe sat pale and motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing, as if willing herself to disappear into the seat. Across from her, Leo Barrett leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but pointed. "What are you going to do now?" Erica swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sand. "Maybe it won't be that bad," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Leo exhaled, shaking his head. "You really think that?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her hands were clenched into fists in her lap, trembling slightly as the plane continued to descend. Outside, the city lights glittered beneath them. The runway stretched into view, like a ribbon of judgment waiting for her. Reality was approaching, fast, unrelenting. As the aircraft made its final approach, Erica forced herself to breathe. But every inhale felt shallow, tight, because deep down, she already knew. Once the wheels touched down, her life, the one she'd known, the one she'd built, was over. The plane landed with a soft thud, the familiar pull of deceleration pressing everyone gently back into their seats. For most, it signaled the end of a long journey, a chance to move on. But for Erica, it felt like a slow-motion collapse, a final step towards something she could no longer outrun. Her hands were clammy. Her heart pounded furiously as she unbuckled from the jump seat. Overhead, the final announcement crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us." Passengers stirred, stretching limbs, reaching for bags, chatting in quiet, tired voices. But underneath the routine, the tension remained. Eyes flicked toward her, subtle, watchful. No one had forgotten. Erica stood, smoothing her uniform with shaking fingers. Her pulse hammered beneath her ribs. Maybe, just maybe, if she kept her head down, if she moved quickly enough, she could avoid what was coming. She took one hesitant step forward. Then the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the cabin, expression unreadable. Behind him, another crew member followed, clipboard in hand. And then she saw them. Two airline executives in sharp, dark suits were already inside the jet bridge, waiting just beyond the open aircraft door. Beside them stood airport security. Erica's stomach plummeted. Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted toward Elliot Granger, who still sat quietly in his seat. Unbothered. Calm. He hadn't moved to disembark like the others, because he didn't need to. He was the reason they were here. The blood drained from Erica's face. Around her, passengers were standing, gathering bags, the usual sounds of landing chatter filling the air. But this time, it all felt different. There was an energy, palpable and building. Everyone knew. Everyone was waiting for the next moment. Mark Delaney smirked as he pulled his carry-on from the overhead bin. This should be interesting. he muttered to himself. Mildred, still seated beside her husband, watched with quiet intensity. "I'd say I feel bad for her," she murmured, "but I don't." Leo said nothing, but his eyes flicked from Erica to the group outside the door. His grip tightened around the strap of his service bag. Erica's breaths came faster now. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind. This couldn't be happening. She forced her legs to move, one foot in front of the other, heading toward the front of the cabin. But then the captain's voice stopped her. "Erica!" His tone was firm, low, heavy. She turned slowly, dread curling inside her like smoke. "Yes? You need to remain on board," he said. "The executive team needs to speak with you before you disembark." Her mouth went dry. Passengers were moving past her now, some casting sideways glances, others openly watching. Some whispered, others simply stared. She looked toward the jet bridge. The officials and security hadn't moved. They weren't passing through. They were waiting. For her. The air around her felt thick, like it was pressing in on all sides. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat. "This is just a conversation, right?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The captain didn't answer, and that was answer enough. Her knees felt weak. Passengers continued to exit the plane, but no one had forgotten what they'd seen. And Erica. She couldn't run from what was coming next. She couldn't escape the judgment, the humiliation, the weight of every choice she had made on this flight. And though Elliot Granger had yet to speak a single word to her since the reveal, she could still feel the gravity of his presence behind her. Elliot Granger's presence still lingered behind her like a heavy storm cloud, unmoving yet undeniable. Erica Monroe turned just slightly, enough to glimpse him still seated, still calm, his fingers brushing lightly over the surface of his briefcase, as if he had all the time in the world. Her lips parted, a dozen words sitting on the edge of her tongue. Defenses, excuses, a desperate plea for understanding. But then she saw the look in his eyes. There was no anger, no smug satisfaction, only stillness, only certainty. And in that moment, Erica realized something that chilled her to the core. He had known, he had seen this coming, and she had walked into it blindly. The last of the passengers had now disembarked. The plane was quiet, eerily so, save for the lingering crew. The air felt colder, the silence heavier. Leo Barrett stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The captain gave a simple nod toward the open aircraft door. "They're waiting for you." Erica's legs barely responded. Her feet felt like lead as she forced herself forward, one step, then another. Her movements were robotic, as if her body no longer belonged to her. When she reached the door, she hesitated. Her hand gripped the cold metal edge of the doorway. Beyond it, under the harsh artificial lights of the jet bridge, stood three dark silhouettes, unmoving, unreadable. Two suited executives stood in a rigid line, faces blank, giving nothing away. Behind them, two uniformed security officers stood silently, present but not threatening. Their stillness made it clear. She would not be walking away from this unnoticed. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat constricted. The words were stuck, buried beneath the crushing weight of it all. One of the executives, a tall man with sharp features and a name tag that read Anthony Reed, Senior Operations Director, stepped forward. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his tone professional, but cold. "We need to have a conversation about your conduct on this flight." Erica's hands clenched at her sides. "Sir, I—" Anthony raised a hand, stopping her. "Now is not the time to explain yourself. A full review will be conducted," he said, "but I suggest you listen carefully before speaking again." Her mouth shut instantly. Another executive, a woman with sharp black hair and a sleek tablet in hand, stepped up beside him. She tapped the screen and read aloud, "We have already received multiple complaints concerning your treatment of a particular passenger, Mr. Elliot Granger." The name hit Erica like a blow to the chest, another shockwave rippling through her body. "Passenger statements," the woman continued, "along with corroborating observations from other crew members, indicate a consistent pattern of behavior that is both unprofessional and in direct violation of our customer care policy." Erica's breath caught in her throat. I didn't—" "Ms. Monroe," Anthony cut in, his voice firmer now, "we have footage." Her stomach dropped. "Cameras?" she repeated, voice trembling. "Of course. There were cameras in the cabin. For safety. For liability." She had dismissed Elliot so easily, so carelessly, believing he was just another economy passenger, believing there would be no consequence. But Elliot hadn't been just another passenger. And now, there was no place left to hide. Anthony's gaze hardened. "The footage shows you repeatedly ignoring Mr. Granger's reasonable requests, refusing him basic service, and most notably, physically removing his briefcase and intervening when another crew member tried to assist him." "I was following protocol," Erica blurted out, her voice cracking. He didn't pre-order a meal. He wasn't listed." "And yet," Anthony said, cutting her off again, "when your colleague attempted to offer him an available meal, you personally intervened." Erica's voice failed her. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Each word spoken by the executives felt like another nail sealing a door she could no longer open. "We also reviewed your interactions with other passengers," the woman with the tablet continued, her voice composed but firm. "It's clear there was a noticeable difference in how you treated those in first class compared to those in economy, specifically in tone, attentiveness, and overall demeanor." Erica Monroe's hands trembled. She hadn't realized, had never considered, that her unconscious bias had been quietly, consistently recorded. That the way she rolled her eyes, the clipped tone of her voice, the glances she didn't think anyone noticed, it had all been captured. And now it was being held up in front of her like a mirror she couldn't look away from. Anthony Reed stepped closer. His gaze was sharp, cutting through any last illusion she might have held on to. "Ms. Monroe, I'm going to be very clear," he said. "This isn't just about one passenger. It's about a pattern, a behavior that has likely gone unchecked for far too long." Erica felt her lips part slightly, but no sound came. "You didn't just misjudge someone's status," Anthony continued. "You misjudged their character." He paused, then added, "Mr. Granger never asked for special treatment. He never demanded recognition. But do you know what he did do?" Erica remained silent, her heart pounding. "He let you reveal exactly who you are," Anthony said coldly. "And now you're going to answer for it." A sharp gust of air rushed through the jet bridge as the outer door opened again. Erica turned slightly, her stomach twisting into knots. Elliot Granger had stepped off the plane. Passengers moving through the corridor gave him glances. Some whispered. Others simply watched in quiet awe. But Elliot didn't react. He walked slowly, deliberately, with the same quiet composure he'd carried through the entire flight. For the first time since they'd landed, Erica saw him in full. Not just a frail man in a wrinkled coat, not just a quiet, elderly traveler. He walked with purpose, with weight, with dignity. His briefcase was still tucked beneath his arm. His eyes were steady, unreadable. The executives shifted instantly. Their postures straightened. Their expressions changed. "Mr. Granger," Anthony greeted, his voice suddenly reverent. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for—" Elliot lifted a single hand. Just a gesture. Anthony fell silent immediately. The power shift was unmistakable. "I trust you'll handle this appropriately," Elliot said, his voice quiet, but firm. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. There was steel in his tone, calm and measured, but commanding. The woman with the tablet nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. We're taking this very seriously." Elliot gave a small nod, then turned. Finally, his eyes met Erica's. Her stomach turned, because there was no anger in his gaze, no gloating, no pleasure in watching her squirm. That made it worse. He didn't look at her like someone who needed to be punished. He looked at her like someone who had already lost. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, to plead. But deep down, she knew. There was nothing left to say. Elliot adjusted the strap of his briefcase. "I don't believe in revenge," he said evenly. "But I do believe in accountability." The words hit harder than any disciplinary write-up could have. Anthony turned back to Erica, face unreadable. "Ms. Monroe, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension, pending full investigation," he stated. "You are expected to fully cooperate with the review process. Your access to all airline systems and operational duties will be revoked until further notice." Her breath hitched. "Suspension?" She opened her mouth, desperate. "Sir, please, But Anthony's cold stare silenced her. "This meeting is over," he said. "We'll be in touch regarding next steps." Erica stood frozen. Passengers continued to pass, some throwing glances over their shoulders, others whispering under their breath. But the damage was done. She stood like a ghost in the jet bridge. Her world, her authority, her identity, unraveling around her. Leo passed by slowly, casting her one last glance before he turned and walked away. Mark Delaney paused for just a second, shaking his head before following the others. And then Elliot walked past her. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Erica watched him disappear into the terminal, the weight of it all crashing into her chest like a falling wall. It was over, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The voices of the executives had faded into a dull hum in Erica Monroe's mind, drowned beneath the deafening beat of her own heart. She barely felt the stiff, airline-issued uniform clinging to her skin. She hardly registered the stares of passengers who had witnessed her unraveling. Reality was settling in now. Suspension, investigation, the looming certainty of termination. It hung over her like a storm she hadn't seen coming. Her thoughts spiraled, racing, grasping for escape routes that didn't exist. Maybe she could argue her case. Maybe she could frame it as a miscommunication. Maybe, just maybe, it was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But then she looked up, and she saw Elliot Granger, disappearing into the terminal with the same quiet dignity he had worn throughout the flight. And that was when the truth hit her. There was no saving this. She had played her hand. and she had lost. Her legs felt numb as she stumbled toward the side of the jet bridge, bracing herself against the cold wall. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, her chest tight with panic. The executives had turned away from her now, speaking in hushed voices. She was no longer part of the conversation. She was no longer anyone's concern. Just hours ago, she had been in control, walking the aisles with confidence, giving orders, brushing off complaints. She had believed herself untouchable. How many flights had she worked where passengers had grumbled under their breath but never pushed back? How many times had she dismissed someone, knowing the complaint would get lost in bureaucracy? But Elliot hadn't grumbled. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply waited. And that, she realized, was far more dangerous. The blood drained from her face as she recalled every moment in painful clarity, the impatient sighs, the sarcastic tone, the way she took his bag from his hands like he was a nuisance. She had treated the owner of the airline like he was beneath her. She had belittled a man who had built the very company she wore on her chest. And now, she was paying the price. A sudden movement near the terminal entrance caught her eye, pulling her from her downward spiral. She turned her head. A small group of airline employees had gathered nearby, whispering to one another. Their eyes flicked between Elliot and the corporate team. Their expressions were filled with confusion and recognition. The news was spreading. Her humiliation wasn't going to stay confined to this jet bridge. By the end of the day, staff in every corner of the airport would know. By the end of the week, it would be company-wide. The flight where an attendant dragged an elderly man down the aisle, only to find out he owned the airline. Erica's stomach turned violently. She could already hear the whispers in training rooms, the stares in crew lounges, the way her name would be dropped like a cautionary tale. Don't pull a Monroe. Her breath hitched as she pushed herself off the wall. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stay here any longer. But just as she reached the end of the jet bridge, a voice called out, "Ms. Monroe." She froze. Her fingers curled into fists. Anthony Reed, still composed and distant, stepped forward. His tone was as cool and detached as ever, the voice of a man who had delivered more terminations than he could count. He hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "Consider yourself fortunate that Mr. Granger did not request immediate termination," he said. "Had he insisted, you wouldn't even be offered a review." Erica's throat tightened. Anthony glanced down at his tablet, scrolling briefly. "The final decision will come from corporate," he added. "But if I were you, I'd start thinking seriously about other career options." She flinched. The words landed with more weight than she expected. She wanted to object, to insist that she could fix this, that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but she knew better. Nothing she said now would matter. Anthony turned away, joining the other executives, their quiet conversation continuing without her, already moving on. She had become irrelevant. With shaking hands, Erica reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she tapped through her messages. No new emails, no reassurances, no one reaching out to defend her. Only silence. Her reputation was already beginning to crumble. Soon, Erica Monroe's employment status would follow the path her reputation had already taken, into freefall. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Elliot Granger walked with the same steady, composed steps that had defined him the entire flight. His expression was unreadable, but his presence still spoke volumes. Passengers who had witnessed the events stood quietly off to the side, Some whispered, some simply watched him walk by. Mark Delaney, the businessman, exhaled through his nose and gave a subtle nod, more to himself than anyone else. He had seen power before, in boardrooms, behind closed doors. But this quiet, unspoken power left a different kind of mark. A few feet away, Mildred and Henry, the elderly couple, watched Elliot disappear into the crowd. "I wonder what happens now," Mildred murmured. Henry adjusted his shoulder bag. "Whatever it is," he said, "she won't forget it." Near the entrance, Leo Barrett lingered, watching Elliot with a quiet admiration that didn't need words. He had been the only one who tried to do the right thing. And Elliot had noticed. Elliot paused, turning slightly. Their eyes met. A small nod, nothing more. But to Leo, it meant everything. Back in the jet bridge, Erica still stood motionless. The world felt like it was closing in around her. Her fingers trembled around her phone. The weight of everything she'd done pressed against her chest, sinking deeper and deeper into her ribs. This wasn't a bad shift. This wasn't a bad day. This was the moment that would define her entire career. And as she watched Elliot vanish into the crowd, she understood what so many others had already figured out. There was no undoing this, no rewinding, no recovery. She remained in the jet bridge long after he was gone. The silence around her, louder than any reprimand. Her thoughts spiraled, looping through every decision she had made, every look, every word, every moment she could have done the right thing, but chose not to. A part of her still clung to a dying hope. Maybe if I explain, maybe if I make them understand. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. She hadn't followed protocol. She had followed her own bias, her own frustration. Her snap judgments of people based on their age, their clothes, their class. And the worst part? She had done it without even thinking. Her breathing became shallow as she watched the last of the passengers disappear into the glowing corridors of the terminal. The airport outside pulsed with movement. Families reunited. Professionals hurried to gates. People laughed, argued, rebooked. Life had moved on, but she hadn't. Her world had just stopped. A lump formed in her throat as she gripped her phone harder, scrolling desperately through her messages. Nothing. No calls from supervisors. No emails from leadership. No one defending her. No one offering hope. She wasn't important enough to be defended. Her career was slipping through her fingers, and no one was coming to stop it. Leo passed by quietly, giving her a lingering glance. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. You were warned, and you didn't listen. She had dismissed his concern. She had rolled her eyes at his warnings. She had ignored every chance to act with empathy. Now she stood alone, drowning in consequences of her own making. Erica forced her feet to move, legs stiff with dread, as she stepped out into the terminal. Near the far exit, the executive team still stood in conversation, deep in discussion, unbothered by her. She thought, briefly, about approaching them, begging for reconsideration. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Elliot Granger hadn't even needed to ask for her removal. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He just waited, calm, patient, watching, and that had been enough. She had handed him everything he needed to bring her down. Her breath hitched as she passed a group of airline employees already whispering about what had happened. They all knew. She spotted a cluster of flight attendants near the crew lounge. They glanced her way, then quickly turned their heads, pretending not to notice, but she could feel it. Her presence had changed. She wasn't seen as a leader anymore. She was seen as a lesson, the one who messed up, the one who became a story, a warning. She had gone from authority to example, and part of her wanted to turn and run, to escape the humiliation that waited beyond the terminal doors. But there was nowhere left to run. Her career, her name, the life she had built in this industry, it was all hanging by a thread she had already snapped. The thread was slipping, and Erica Monroe could no longer hold on. She spotted Anthony Reeves speaking in hushed tones with another executive, both of them scrolling intently through their phones. Her stomach twisted. She knew exactly what they were looking at. Corporate had already been informed. By tomorrow, her name would be on internal agendas. By the end of the week, she'd be summoned for a formal review. And after that, she already knew. Suspension was just the beginning. Termination was waiting at the end. Her hands trembled as she turned away from the two men. Her vision blurred with the heat of shame. She needed air. She needed to breathe. She pushed her way through the terminal, weaving past travelers and staff alike. She could feel their eyes, could hear their whispers, even when they didn't speak. That's her, the one who mistreated the owner. She didn't even know who he was. I heard she dragged him down the aisle. The rumors had already begun to grow, morphing, twisting, spreading. And it wouldn't be long before they reached the outside world, before a shaky video hit social media, before screenshots of internal memos leaked online, before she became a headline. Her jaw clenched. Her breath came in short, painful bursts. She finally reached the sliding glass doors at the airport exit. They hissed open, letting in the cool night air. But it didn't help. The storm inside her raged louder than anything outside. This wasn't just a terrible day. It was the end of everything. Her phone buzzed in her hand. For a moment, just a moment, hope flickered. Maybe someone was defending her. Maybe a manager was trying to get ahead of the story. Maybe she still had a chance. She looked down. One email. Subject: urgent. Immediate suspension notice from Airline corporate. Her fingers hovered above the screen, breath shaking. But she didn't open it. She already knew what it said. The walls of her world had caved in. And now, all she could do was stare at the glowing letters confirming what she had already feared. This was the end. The city lights beyond the terminal blurred. Her phone trembled in her hand, fingers white from the grip. She could feel the night wind against her face, but it did nothing to calm her. Her breath hitched, her heart pounded, her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. How had it come to this? She thought of everything. Every second of that flight, every word, every look of dismissal. Every time she spoke to Elliot Granger like he was beneath her. The tone in her voice, the sighs, the way she snatched his bag like it didn't matter who he was. Or rather, like it did. And she had already decided he was a nobody. How easily she had denied him something as simple as a meal. Not once had she hesitated. She had been so sure, so confident in her power. She had believed that policy would protect her. But now, standing here, alone, humiliated, she saw the truth. It had never been about policy. It had been about control. And she had abused it. And everyone had seen it. The passengers, the crew, the owner, and now, the world. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. She didn't want to look. But she did. Subject: Disciplinary review meeting. Scheduled. There it was. The final step before the inevitable. A lump rose in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to break something. But she knew. Nothing she did now would change a thing. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement near the airport's main entrance. A small group of flight attendants had gathered there, chatting quietly. One of them glanced her way, then another. She didn't need to hear what they were saying. She already knew. She was the story now. The whispered warning. The example shared in training rooms. Don't be like Monroe. She turned away quickly, her pulse surging. Panic clawed at her throat like a vice. She had been flying for years. So many flights, she couldn't even remember them all. But never, not once, had she felt this small. Erica Monroe had never felt smaller. Each step toward the airport exit was heavy, her legs moving only because they had to. Her body running on instinct now, not purpose. She didn't know where she was going. And at this point, it didn't matter. What did matter was this. She was alone, utterly, completely, undeniably alone. She had spent the entire flight making Elliot Granger feel like nothing. She had dismissed him, ignored him, treated him like a burden, like his presence was an inconvenience, as if he didn't belong. And now? She finally understood exactly what that felt like, because she wasn't Erica Monroe, senior flight attendant anymore. She was no one, no job, no respect, no future in the industry she had once taken pride in. Her career hadn't ended when she stepped off that plane. It had crashed long before the wheels even touched down. And Elliot? He had walked away with the same quiet strength he had carried all along. No shouting, no retribution, no need for revenge. He had simply let her reveal herself and unravel. She had written the ending of her own story, with every cold glance, every careless word. As Erica stepped out into the city, swallowed by shadows and glowing signs, one final thought struck her with crushing clarity. She had misunderstood what power really meant. For years, she believed it was about control, about making rules, about being the voice people had to obey. But now, standing in the chill of the night, her life in ruins, she understood. True power doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It doesn't need to be announced. True power walks quietly and never has to prove itself.